Hello, welcome to another episode of Historically Speaking. Our episode today is going to celebrate 50 years of the Community College of Vermont. My guest today is Dr. Fern Fryer, whom I'll tell you a little bit about. But a year ago, as she was telling me that the Community College of Vermont was celebrating its 50th anniversary, I thought this is a happy occasion which this community can celebrate, but then came COVID, so this is a celebration deferred. My guest, Dr. Fern Fryer, has been affiliated with the Community College of Vermont for almost 30 years. I have known her and her husband Dana for many years. I've watched their 4 sons grow into fine young adults. We have in common our commonality as educators, church members, and also our love of classics, because Fern's doctorate is actually in classics, Greek and Latin. And what do you do with such a background? Well, it's a great foundation for doing so many other things. So with that, let's talk about why 50 years of the Community College of Vermont is worth celebrating.
Thank you, Michael. CCV began back in 1970, and it was really a huge experiment in equity. The people who began it realized that for many Vermonters, college education on the traditional model was simply not an option, and they wanted to find out how we could better serve them. And so they put a grant together, got money to study it, and they were really targeting rural Vermonters who might not be able to go to a campus and live there full-time. And so throughout, our mission has been access, affordability, student success. We have 12 locations now and online learning, so that puts us within 25 miles of 95% of Vermonters, which is really what our focus is. We have always been student-centered. And I'm not going to read through all of these things, but your viewers can skim through that. We have grown tremendously in those 50 years to become now Vermont's second largest college. So let me just take you back a little bit to the early years. 1970, the governor created the Vermont Regional Community College Commission under the push of Peter Smith, who was the first president. And as I said, they applied for a grant, and when they got it, they found an office space in a former tavern in Montpelier, and they had that single office and offered 10 courses. Instructors didn't get paid, students didn't pay tuition. It really was an experiment, and that flexibility, adaptability has survived until this day in pretty much everything we do. There is a passion you find among CCV staff, CCV instructors, and the students as well. It really is a community, not just a college. So I can't speak highly enough of it. It becomes embedded in your philosophy.
Doesn't it surprise you that 1970 is 50 years ago? And I think as all of us get older, we realize, wow, we were alive and well and kicking, and when all of these things happened. And I know, moving closer to the present, one of the things that is a teacher that I appreciated is that it allows the flexibility of some high school students to begin college courses. And that is something that back in 1970, we wouldn't have been thinking about that.
Not at all. And in the 90s, we began looking into that, but especially in the 2000s is when that concept of dual enrollment kicked in, and CCV has been in the forefront of leading that charge. And of course, since then, the governor and the legislature have been pushing for that as well. In fact, here's a picture of early classrooms, right? Just talking about our flexibility. Not even a classroom, just wherever. Hardware store one time was a spot for a class. So wherever we could, we fit students in to bring higher ed to them. And then throughout the 80s, we were expanding and really getting ourselves known academically, because there was some pushback from places like UVM and other VSC colleges about, were your courses really college level? And so in the 70s, we had gotten our first NEASC accreditation, and then in the 80s, we got the first 10-year accreditation and began building newer centers in spots, including Rutland. We began around 1981, so I'm told, but not in our own place. We were sharing office space with Castleton, who had a evening program at the time. But enrollment kept growing, and you can see some of the typical scenes from the 80s here. You recognize that old-style computer that looks so clunky. And CCV Rutland first had its own place on Center Street in 1985.
Is that, well, I know that building. Do you know what the original purpose was of that building?
I have read that it was the jail.
It was the jail,
Right.
yes. And I knew the co-owners of the building
Oh,
for many
nice.
years. It was Bob Tepper and Stephen Dardek. It was their law offices. So it was funny when people would go into that building, they would say, oh, you're in the former jail. I think the jail was actually in the basement.
Oh, so that's
Yeah.
where the CCV office was apparently, down in the basement. And I think now it's some law offices
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and other things like that. But I have read some of the stories that former people wrote in honor of the 50 years, and I was just reading the other day that although CCV began officially maybe around 1981 offering courses, in 1986, we were tanking here in Rutland. We were down to 70 students. It was pretty rough. And so Betty Mikowski, who was the regional director, was given the job of go down to Rutland and fix it. And she said, well, what happens if I can't? And she was told by our president, well, you'll be job hunting.
Ah,
And so she came down, and she didn't say how she did it. She did say Rutland was a tough nut to crack. But in 2 years, she had gotten triple the enrollment.
wow, wow.
Right. And so at that point, we were ready to move on. The spot was too small. And then we moved to the service building, which is the picture you see next on the slide. And we were there for about 3 years. Again, sharing office space with the Castleton external nighttime degree program. And following that, though, we moved into the 90s, and things just kept booming. Internet, right, was starting to come in, and because of CCV's unique geographic distribution, we have 12 centers. Virtually every town of any size in Vermont has a CCV center. That's great for reaching Vermonters, but it makes coordination and centralization really difficult. So in '92, we were able to use a virtual campus to connect via computer networks, and that led to online learning, which really took off. We were among the first in Vermont, certainly, to explore the idea of online learning, and opened our 13th academic center, which is online learning. And today we have, I think, at least a third of our classes online, and 23 associate or certificate programs can be done totally online.
Since CCV was among the leaders in the state in online learning, and for me, teaching high school, it was kind of an awkward novelty because you had telephone pickups and
Oh, yeah.
it wasn't really interactive. So I think that you folks were kind of the torch bearers in that. But having learned the art of teaching before technology, without all of those kinds of supports, what do you see both as positive and negative aspects of the role that technology has played in education?
That's an interesting question. We could probably spend more than this half hour on. The positives are that it brings it to more people. Single parents who may not be able to go to the classroom, for example, because there's no childcare. So it reaches more students, which is always one of our goals, providing that possibility for higher ed to a greater number of people. Negative is certainly in spots still in Vermont, network is not real efficient, and so that can create glitches. There's a learning curve. You know, we talk about today's students as, oh, they're digital natives and they know so much more than
Yeah, we're digital immigrants.
people our age do.
Yeah.
And that's true when it comes to their phones, perhaps, but it's really a myth. And I have attended conferences where they talk about that myth to educators. So there is a learning curve for students to how do I navigate an online classroom and what do I do? But a real benefit of technology that came out during COVID, everyone jumped to Zoom and did lots of meetings with Zoom. At CCV, we started doing some of our online classes synchronously. So a class that might have been intended to meet on ground now had a 2-hour Zoom meeting that was required for students. And I actually had the opportunity to do those this whole past year. And it was amazing. The students were so excited to be visually connected with people because we've all been shut up for so long, that was a huge benefit of technology that I think is here to stay. So there is a lot of flexibility with technology that you can deliver good classes.
Probably for me, the most notable manifestation of the staying power of CCV was the new building. And I mean, for something of that size in its location, what it replaced, wow. And the few times that I have been in, I've been very impressed by that as a learning center. So how has that building helped CCV deliver?
That's a good question also. You can see on this slide the two places we were most recently prior to that. After the service building, we moved into the House Center, and that's where I began my career with CCV. And we had, I think it was the 3rd floor, if I remember correctly, but really there were very few classrooms there. I taught at the what's now the Rutland Middle School, which was the high school, I think, at that time. So very few classroom available in the House Center, and there was a problem with the night classes because about 8:30, which was just about the time classes would get out, a train came across and it just sat there, and so you couldn't get to your car in the parking lot. Right, so that was a problem. So after 6 or 7 years, we outgrew that space, moved into Evelyn Street, and we were just amazed because we had so much space and it was all ours, and we outgrew that. And then moved to the building that you were talking about, which is amazing. 3 floors, science labs on the top. We use it as a community space, really. Castleton sometimes comes and does things there. We have run AP exams for the high schools there. Other community organizations will use it's called our big room, where there is a lot of space for a lecturer and things like that, receptions. So it has been wonderful.
As you've interacted with your students, and again, we want to preserve people's privacy, but in general, can you recount some success stories, particularly among non-traditional students, of how this has really impacted the quality of their life?
Education is transformative. It really is. That's my personal philosophy, and that's one of the reasons I fit in so well at CCV, because that is CCV's philosophy too. I am so inspired and humbled by my students to see what many of them have gone through and how they persevere and become self-sufficient, productive adults leading satisfying, happy lives. Certainly, I have had students with various abuse issues that they are working through, substance abuse. I have had victims of other types of abuse, and often they will open up and share these things. So at times you feel almost like a counselor as well. But again, they make it through their 2-year degree or their certificate. We're also developing a lot of certificates now, workplace-oriented, and they go out and find jobs.
Has the demographic changed much over the last 10 years?
Yes, over the last 10, and even more so after the last 30. When I started teaching here, virtually all of the students were older than me. And it's not just that I've aged, but the average age has gone down. When I first began in the 90s, GE had recently laid off, and they were paying their workers to come back and get educated. We have, since the 2000s really, started targeting high schoolers as well. And so typically, in the summer, I would teach for the last 3 or 4 years an intensive English comp class that was almost entirely high school students who would come and then not have to take English the next year, as well as getting a college credit. So it has definitely moved the age down somewhat.
You know, working with the students that I did for many years, and many of them would be first-generation college students, so there was no example to follow or experience with parents. And I think one of the most daunting things for many of our rural kids and even kids that live in the city is just the cost in navigating it and how am I going to figure this out. And I think that this is where the Community College of Vermont has been such an important bridge to getting people skills and a scope that they needed that they might not have otherwise accessed.
Exactly, and if your viewers can see this slide about the 2000s, it was in 2001 that we introduced our Introduction to College Studies, which does exactly what you're talking about. Helps with those soft skills for high school students and particularly first gens. What does it mean to have to study for an exam, you know, or to have all of this time that you have to self-discipline and structure to get your work done? And so we introduced ICS, we call it, and we began Fast Forward, which was in the tech centers with the high school students, and then from that it grew into dual enrollment and concurrent classes. So you might be taking a history class in your high school with your high school teacher, and some of the students in that class are also enrolled for college credit, and then the teacher has to be giving them some extra work. And then there's also the vouchers that high school students can use and for free come and take a class at CCV. And that's a whole different experience than taking it in your high school, even if you're getting college credit there.
After almost 30 years, I can only imagine the number of different courses that you've taught, not to mention those that you invent because of need. So can you give us an idea of the scope of things that you have taught, either by content or skill? And you have lots of favorites, I know, but what would be among the favorite things that
Me
you've taught?
personally?
Yes, yes.
Oh, I have taught everything. You know, we were saying, what can you do with a classics degree? I taught medical terminology for a while because that is all based on Greek and Latin. I have an MA in classical archaeology, so I've taught archaeology. I've done history of the Western World one, so like up to 1500. Intro to research methods. Two of my favorites are our bookend classes. We have a freshman introductory course called Dimensions of Learning, well, Dimensions of Self and Society now. I guess it has morphed through many different things. And that's something that they ideally take in their first semester, certainly their first year, and it does a lot of the soft skills for this is college. You know, here's what you can expect, here's how you handle it, as well as a lot of reading. One of my favorite novels to use in that is Fahrenheit 451, which they are always shocked is so relevant to today, having been written more than 50 years ago at this point. The other bookend is our capstone course they need to get their associate's degree, and it's called Seminar in Educational Inquiry, or SEI, and it really has nothing to do with the field of education. It's more about inquiring into their educational process and who they are as people and what they've learned and pulling it all together. So that is one that I teach virtually every semester. That's one of my favorites. Another favorite is mythology, of course. And I'm doing both of those this summer. Another area, and I'll speak to this because this is a new venture that we began maybe 2 years ago. It's called Flex classes. Again, you know, affordability, accessibility is always our goal, and Flex classes are classes that a student does totally self-paced. So it's all online, and if they want to work through it in 4 weeks, they can do that if they want to take the full 15 weeks. So a couple years ago, I designed 3 1-credits, critical thinking, effective leadership, and personal and professional effectiveness. All those kind of speak to the soft skills. we're also developing flex in many other areas of normal classes. So we have science classes that might be flex option, or psychology, or virtually anything. So that's an area that we're expanding on as we see increased demand for that.
The other day, I was thinking, I don't know why, about Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth. And that was
favorite.
one of my favorite PBS series of the
Absolutely.
80s. Read the book, and those things of learning about the hero and archetypes, and that is something where that classical foundation really does give people the insight and the tools to, oh, this movie or this TV show is following this. So I bet that once kids are given those tools, and there was once upon a time that most kids knew about Edith Hamilton's mythology, or even in my grandparents' time, Bullfinch, but not so much anymore. So I bet that your students really take to learning about mythology and recognizing paradigms and archetypes.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm teaching an online mythology this summer, and I was just reading posts yesterday. It is so eye-opening for them, and really development of their personality, to see all of the themes and myths, and we do world mythology, not just classical mythology, but to recognize all the places it pops up in their daily life still, not to mention Marvel movies with Thor and all kinds of stories as well. The growth that you see in them over the semester is truly amazing.
So coming through this pandemic, and I'm glad that I was out of the classroom, because I know that the anguish and the anxiety that my friends have of not knowing from day to day, are you going to be in person, are you going to be remote? What are the greatest lessons for you as an educator coming through this? And really, what are you beginning to look forward to about the easing of some of the social distance restrictions?
Lessons coming through it. Well, I think one of the biggest lessons is how effective that synchronous class was, because it's a blend. There's the synchronous 2-hour Zoom class, but there's also a lot of online components that they have to work through during the week. And for me, with the SEI especially, that was extremely effective. Looking forward to the easing, we are going back to more on-ground classes in the fall, although I don't have any on-ground, just online for this fall. So it will be nice to get back in the building, though. I haven't been in the building for over a year.
Wow.
So that, I'm looking forward to that.
So if we are to highlight what you are most proud of with your personal experience, and again, part of the reason that we're doing this show is to share this anniversary, 50+1, with the community. What do we want our audience to most value about this 50-year experience?
That CCV is part of our community here in Rutland, as well as virtually every other town, and it presents a really valuable option for people to consider whether they're coming out of high school, whether they're midlife, or even retired. That we have all kinds of programs. If you don't want a full 2-year associate's degree, there are certificates that focus on the career skills in whatever career you're looking at. There is we have a very strong Gen Ed, general education program, that you could come and take classes just to learn. So many of the students come away with the idea that they are lifelong learners, and I often hear, I never thought I could succeed. You know, a lot of the students we get are not the ones who are typically targeted for 4-year educations, although many of ours do go on to 4-year. But they may have received messages in the past about, you're not really that, you're not capable. And they get to CCV, and CCV really believes in its students passionately. And we are all about student success. And so they say, hey, I can do this. And the self-confidence, it does transform lives.
Knowing that you also are a lifelong learner and are continually redesigning, reevaluating courses based on student needs is you think about what you haven't been able to teach yet. What might lie in the future, or something that you would like to see placed in the curriculum that isn't there yet?
Well, I always love Latin, but I know that's not happening. I did do some independent studies in the 90s with that. What I would like to see, that is a tough one. I would like to see a return to more history classes, I think. I think there is a lack of awareness of just how important it is among many people in today's society.
And having been part of all of that at the state level, it certainly is a fractious debate on what students should learn and how they should learn it. But I think that, and I wholeheartedly, obviously, the premise of this show is that we value history, but history has fought to survive as an independent entity because to me, it's the cornerstone of the social studies, but it still has its own unique identity as a discipline. And that, in my opinion, has been lost in many schools when we don't say that this is foundational. And yet, I think what happens without history and knowing something of foundation and big ideas, we can be easily swayed by other things.
Absolutely. Without that foundation and grounding in what came before, you misinterpret what's happening today.
Well, I want to thank you for being our guest today. It's been wonderful to talk with you and to share some of your accomplishments at the Community College of Vermont, and for people when they pass by that building to have a much stronger sense of what goes on there. So in thanking you, I'd like to give you the valediction here of what you would like to say in wrapping up that perhaps you haven't had a chance to say yet.
Well, I think I would just direct your viewers to the slide on CCV today and look at all the associate degrees, career certificates, small class size. Most people come part-time. You know, if you've ever wanted to expand your horizons, we're there on West Street, and I hope that you come.
Well, thank you. Thank you. A friend of mine, now deceased, who taught Latin at Rutland High School for many years, her name was Madeline Buttles, and her motto was LLT, LLT, and she would make her students chant that. Latin lives today. And that can be our postscript to the audience. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you.
You're welcome.